Welcome to From the Mind of Christine McConnell. So we're back in my kitchen for this episode. I'm going to be making a homemade apple pie, but it's not just going to be any apple pie. I'm going to be doing a really beautiful, intricate sort of top on it with the pastry. I've made this pie twice before in my life, but never done it on camera before. So it seemed like it was really popular when I first made it, and now I can actually show you how to make it, which seems like a kind of fun episode in a month that so many of us are sort of stuck in the house and wanting to do something fun and different. And this sort of requires ingredients that most of us have in our house, which is a big bonus. This pie is kind of special to me because it's actually the first pie, I think, that I ever made. And I'll be obviously updating the recipe with all of the things that I've learned since then. But I think you should really enjoy it, and I think we're ready to begin. Our first step is going to be to have some ice cold water on hand that we're going to use for our pastry. Next, you'll need to put 4 cups of all-purpose flour in a large mixing bowl, half a teaspoon of salt, and nearly half a cup of Crisco shortening. Once you have that mixed, you can add 4 heaping tablespoons of sugar and 2 1/2 sticks butter, or 1 1/4 cup of butter. With pastry, you really want to touch it as little as possible, as the heat from your hands tends to make kind of a mealier crust, and the less you touch it and the colder you keep it, the flakier your crust will be. I typically add about 3/4 of a cup icy cold water, incorporating just a little bit at a time until I get just the right texture. Once I have a dough that's neither too crumbly or too sticky, I break it into 2 sections, wrap it in plastic wrap, and stick it in the refrigerator for about half an hour. About a year ago, I switched to a mainly plant-based diet. This was something I never expected to try, but I did it. And then once I was comfortable doing it, I started obviously investigating sort of how animals are treated. And I just realized it wasn't something I wanted to return to, but it did kind of leave me with this career issue of I'm known for baking, and I had to kind of figure out what I could do to continue doing the work that I love, but also, not using like buttermilk and eggs in every other project. So that's kind of what spurred this idea to even do this episode, was to see if I could figure out workarounds for all of those things. So now we are just about ready to roll out that first layer of dough, and I started digging around in my cupboards and I realized I've packed away all of my really fancy, nice pie dishes and rolling pins, so I'm just gonna kind of have to work with what I have here. I'm going to butter and flour this before I roll out that dough and get it ready, because you always want to have sort of your pieces prepared as much as you can in advance. There's a lot of creative ways of transferring rolled out pastry into your pie dish, and for me, because it's the base and it's not technically going to be seen, it doesn't have to look perfect, I tend to just roll it out on parchment paper and then just as fast as I can flip it over. For this pie, I'm going to leave just about a 1/2 inch overhang of the pastry, and then I'm going to go back around and tuck that in. Now that I'm getting ready to actually start making the pie filling, I decided to put on a fun little apron I made. And something you kind of always want to do is have like a dish towel like attached to you, because this is messy and you're just going to run through a million paper towels, and this just kind of cuts out the middleman a little bit. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to mix some of the fillings that I'm going to put, sort of sprinkle in between the layers of the apples. I'm gonna set that aside first before I start cutting those, because once you start cutting the apples, you've kind of begun a timer of, even though we're using lemons to prevent them from browning too much, you kind of want to have as many things prepared before you start cutting the apples. So that's what I'm doing now. And I'm going to get 3/4 cups of, 3/4 of a cup. Yes, I think that sounds right. Of brown sugar, and put that in here. If I can find one, this is a cup, but I'll just eyeball it. And that seems about right. Then we're going to do about 1/4 cup of flour. And this is a pretty, I want to say this is an important stage, because the filling of your pie is really, it's going to speak louder than anything else about the pie. And I'm going to use a couple different things with this. I've got, I kind of like mixing and matching my own little things that I add to pies. And I'm going to do cinnamon, about 1 teaspoon. If I can find my little teaspoon guy, here we go. You can overdo cinnamon really easily, and you don't want to do that. A tiny bit of nutmeg, not too much. I'm using this, but I don't really know why. Just sprinkle a little on. And then I like adding a tiny bit of cloves. I feel like it brings out a little bit of an extra flavor from the apples. But again, this is when you just want to get a dash of, really not too much. Even that was too much. Then we're going to whisk these together. And this is just something you kind of want to have on hand as you do this. And I always make a mess. I'm a very messy baker. I don't know about you, but I annihilate kitchens every single time I come near them. There's a couple different ways you can make an apple pie. As far as, a lot of people cut up their apples and do this stage sort of on the stove. And the reason I'm not doing that is because I personally, I like thin slices on an apple pie, and I like there to be a specific order to how they're arranged, so it not only looks pretty, but also as you cut into it, it's just kind of magical and pretty. So that's why I do that this way. I'm doing a mix of Gala apples and Granny Smith. I'm using Gala as opposed to, like, I think it's Braeburn is one that's really good. But Gala I just had around the house, and if you find yourself in similar shoes, apples are apples, and they'll pretty much all work, I want to say, except I can't think of the name, but it's one of them, maybe Macintosh. One of them is terrible for apple pie, but Granny Smith are great just because they're so tart. The first thing you want to do is, where am I going to do this? Let me think about this. I want to get zest for this lemon and set that aside. So let me do that. Again, I packed everything away thinking I was moving like this month, so now I don't have my juicer, and I'm just gonna have to do this the caveman way. Okay, so now we're going to peel all of our apples. And I've got 2 bowls set up here because I want to keep these 2 breeds separate until I combine them in sort of an organized way. So I'm gonna experiment with 2 different kinds of peelers. This was like an impulse purchase from the internet, and I like it, but it kind of feels dangerous. Like, I always feel like I'm gonna cut my finger or something. So I've got a tried and true, and I'm gonna probably alternate between the 2 and see which is more effective. Let's start with the dangerous one. And yes, I can see that it is rusty, but I have had my tetanus shot, and I'm hoping this is okay. Lemon juice seriously enhances the flavors of apple, peach, and blueberry pies, so you can be pretty generous with it. So while I peel and cut up these apples, I was thinking I could tell you kind of a funny story. When I very first started this career, before I actually knew it was going to be a career, I just started like baking in my kitchen and like little silly projects, but making, kind of a huge mess like I still do. And I can remember so clearly my dad saying, Christine, there's no money in cakes. You're not going to make any kind of a living off of this. And that was his 2 cents. Being, people give what they view as helpful advice, and sometimes it is helpful advice. And the truth is, making a living doing art is super difficult. But in this instance, I'm glad I didn't listen to him. And then on top of that, one of the very first pies I ever made was this tree pie that I'm showing you how to make, that I've improved in so many ways. But I made it for a contest. There was a pie contest in the city that I was working in. And I, worked really hard to make a huge disaster of my kitchen and put together this really pretty pie, or at least what I thought was really pretty. And I submitted it and it didn't place at all. It was just sort of, I'm not really a competitive person, and it's probably because I don't know, I don't like losing. I don't feel good if I win over somebody else. But I totally lost. They didn't even notice that I had made something. And I went and sat in my car and I called my hostage behind the camera and I told him, I was like, I didn't win. And his response was, can we be done with the baking now? Can we be done with this whole like baking thing you've been getting into? And I think that's very ironic that he felt that way, because he's looking at me now. And I think it has worked out. So I guess what the point of the story that I'm trying to tell you is sometimes people that love you have very well-meaning advice. But the truth is, if you feel excited and passionate about something, you should kind of just follow your gut and do what makes you truly happy, so long as it doesn't hurt animals. Typically when you bake a pie like this, you put little dabs of butter in between the layers as you build it and stack it. But because we're making this plant-based, I'm not going to use butter, which is so difficult because butter is so delicious. So I'm going to have to come up with sort of my own concoction that's going to go in between those layers. I'm going to start with about 3 tablespoons of plant-based butter, a heaping teaspoon of a good quality vanilla, then add that lemon zest and a few cranks of a coarse salt. Then sprinkle on about 1/8 of a cup of granulated sugar and combine. To really up the flavor, I'm going to add a teaspoon of a natural maple syrup and a heaping teaspoon of the solid part of coconut milk that you can just get in a can. It's meant for Thai cooking. Then baste your pastry with a creamed mixture. I'm alternating the layers of the Granny Smith and Gala apples, starting from the bottom all the way to the top. So I'm going to break continuity just a tiny bit and confess that now I'm actually on day 2, which normally if I'm baking a pie, it's like an afternoon project typically. But when you start incorporating being fully made up and having lights and filming every single little aspect of it, like the time starts sort of bleeding away from you. And so I had to put my pie in the refrigerator overnight unbaked, which I've never done before. And I don't think it's going to dramatically affect it, but just so you're aware of what I'm up to. So now I have a identical size pie dish, and I'm going to sketch out the design that I want using this. So that is my next step. Okay, so the reason that I'm doing this is I'm going to draw out a design, and I've mentioned before that I never get my design just right the first time, so I've got like pencils and erasers, and it's going to be a fun way to sort of sketch out exactly what I want, cut it out, and then lay that on the actual rolled out dough and cut that out. So before we move on to that step, let me give you my 2 cents about pie dishes. I collect pie dishes, and like I mentioned, all of my nice ones are in storage, but I have found from my own personal experience, when you bake pies for other people, you should just assume that the pie dish is part of the gift, because if you were to give away like an heirloom or something your grandmother had passed down, the chances are extremely high you'll never see it again. So just go to thrift stores, go anywhere, and they have really, really beautiful vintagey looking pie dishes that you can sort of collect. And I usually have a stack of about 10 pretty ones that I don't mind giving away at any given moment. And you start realizing very quickly that I want to say maybe only 20% ever make their way back to me. And it's just one of those things that assume it's part of the gift. So let me get going on this. I knew going into this project that the hardest part was going to be coming up with an alternative to an egg wash, because an egg wash gives pastry such a beautiful golden brown color and flavor. So the only way around this is to experiment with a bunch of different options and see if I can't come up with something as good. My first option is an actual egg wash, so I have something to compare the rest to as far as the color and flavor. Next up is agave and oat milk, solid coconut milk and honey, aquafaba and oat milk. Aquafaba is the juice that comes in a can of garbanzo beans. I've seen this on the internet. I'm extremely skeptical about it, but this is an experiment. It seems like a good time to try it out. Number 5 is just straight coconut oil. And number 6 is sugar and oat milk. And then right after that is just going to be bare pastry that I'm going to use as kind of a control. After baking for about 10 minutes, you could clearly see that there were some winners and some losers. The only one that truly matched the original egg wash was the coconut milk and honey, but I thought the aquafaba and oat milk actually came out pretty good looking too. And the hands down winner for flavor was coconut milk and honey. It actually looks and tastes better than a normal egg wash. And I felt that the aquafaba option would actually be really good for a savory pastry. To create the mixture, I used about 3 tablespoons of the solid part of a can of coconut milk and about 2 tablespoons of natural honey. To give the tree a lot of texture and dimension, I layered a bunch of really thin rolled out pastry scraps and then married those together with our honey mixture. To prevent excessive browning of the pastry, I'm creating an aluminum foil dome that I'm going to cut some slits in. You can bake this along with the pie and then take it off or adjust it as you bake just to make sure you end up with a really even, balanced color on the finished pie. While that's in the oven at 375 for about 45 minutes, I'm going to create some decorative little apples out of excess dough that I had left over and a little bit of red food coloring. You want to check on your pie a lot and rotate it often. Right at the end, I cut out a circle in the middle of my dome just to make sure the center could brown and prevent the edges from getting too dark. Total baking time was about an hour and 10 minutes. While it was still super hot, I used the honey mixture to apply the decorative apples. The funny thing about baking a pie is it can look so perfect when you put it in the oven, and then when you take it out, you have something pretty different looking. So if you find yourself in that position, which I have here, I'm realizing I'm going to have to go in and do a few extra flourishes to really make it pop. My first step is going to be to bake some individual leaves separately. And then because there were several parts where the apple didn't really darken as much as I had hoped it would, or didn't become as saturated in the juices as I would have liked, I'm going to make some juice on my stovetop using all of my main ingredients and a touch of brown food coloring. Strain that through a sieve and then hand paint any of the places that I just want to be a little bit darker, so that way the contrast of the pastry really can pop. It is all finished now, and I think I'm ready to cut into it. So obviously this is the next morning. Like I said, filming sort of like lengthens the time on all of these things, but I feel like pie is a really wonderful snack for the morning. It's actually kind of good all day long, in my opinion. If I was able to run to the store, I would have gotten some like dairy-free like whipped topping or something like that, but I'm working with what I have at the moment. As far as the temperature goes, it's really just a matter of taste. I can take pie either hot or cold. I don't like it room temperature. I really generally don't like any pastry at room temperature. So I've actually chilled this overnight, which is for me personally a temperature that I enjoy. But also if I popped it in the oven, it would be equally delicious. So with all of that said, let's cut into it and wrap up this episode. Now, like I said, all of my utensils are in storage, so I don't have like my little pie scooper. So let's see how I'm gonna do this. All right, I'm ready to try this, and hopefully it tastes as pretty as it looks. Oh my gosh. Okay, so I've been making pies for years, and that is the best pie I have ever made, ever. And there's no butter or milk in it, so I cannot believe that. I was expecting to, I was like, if I can just get kind of close, like I'd be pleased, but I guess I experimented quite a bit with this one, and it just totally worked out. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I will be posting the recipe, two recipes, a plant-based recipe as well as just a standard recipe for the $7 and up tier. And I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you very soon.